Hey, and welcome back to VFX Tutors. I'm Josh, and what we're going to do is try something a little bit different now. My tutorials are quite long, so we're going to try like a quick talk over slash time lapse. So I'm going to talk over the sort of methods that I'm using whilst it's a little bit faster. But if you want to go back to the other videos, I'll put chapters in. You can watch them more thoroughly as I do them. This is probably for more the people that want to watch it as a time lapse. So I always start off with my reference. So the reference is very important for pretty much any project you do. All I can say is reference, 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 and you'll hear that everywhere. And you'll always get things like, oh, why it doesn't look right? It's because you just need to follow the reference, and things will become much easier as long as you stick to it, because that's what real life is. So I'm going to use these reference to build my model. So there wasn't a huge amount of reference, so I kind of just went on Google and just grabbed whatever I could. So at this stage, I always start with all my models with basic blocking. So I've just brought in an image plane on my orthographic front camera, and I'm just using basic primitives or geo to build my robot character. And this is probably one of the most important stages of the actual model, because it allows you to sort of create the correct proportions, get a very quick overlook of what it's going to look like without you going too deep into modeling something, then realizing something's completely wrong. So I do this for everything I model, basically. I'll always block it out, and it's pretty much like an industry standard, so you can get the sort of basic look straight out much quicker, so you don't have to wait for a finished product. Excuse me. So obviously I spend quite a long time on blocking, because I feel it's always a pretty crucial stage of the character creation stage. And even though we're doing it like a hard surface modeling here, that still sort of applies for when you're sculpting stuff as well. They just kind of use it as well, they still have blocking, but there's kind of big. I can't remember. They do it in stages, right? So you do like your main shapes, your big sort of blocking shapes. You don't go, say if you're sculpting, you don't go straight into making a sphere, subdividing it 10,000 times, then sculpting straight into the fine detail. This is kind of what we're doing here, so we can get the proportions. So this is kind of applicable for everything, really. So yeah, I do spend quite a long time. Like you don't always have to do this. I would say it's very good practice to do it. Most places will require you to block stuff out first anyway, just so they can get a quick reference of what it's going to look like. So I hope you guys have been enjoying this little series. I'm trying something a bit new. I don't really like doing time lapses, but they seem to be what get more views. Personally, I prefer to watch the long tutorials. Cool. So I think now I've just in this stage, I've just going to start the modeling section, and I'm going to start like attacking bits section by section. So with this one, it's pretty like it's a pretty simple shape. I probably overcomplicated it, but yeah, it's not a complex thing to build, and you can do this loads of other ways, and I'm sure there's other software that does this a lot easier. I just like to make sure that I'm always working in a clean sort of way, and you'll also probably see all my mistakes as well, because I make loads in this series, but everyone does. Don't be fooled by tutorials that don't make mistakes, because they do. It just means if they haven't done any mistakes, that just means they've probably done that tutorial 50 times and they're extremely well rehearsed. It's not really real life, to be honest, and it kind of sets almost a bad example, really, because there's nothing wrong with making mistakes. You can make as many as you want, as long as you fix them. So I'm going to try and explain as much as I can as I go through this. So one of my preferred methods of modeling is actually making the sort of a blocking mesh, then making a higher res blocking mesh. If it's complicated shapes, I don't want to have to figure out the topology and the shape at the same time. So for me, it's easier to make a high res mesh of the blocking. Then I'll just use it as quad draw. So then I'll make that, because then it allows me to build my more complex areas correctly and think more about the topology, which is what I'm kind of sort of doing here. It just allows me to focus on one bit at a time, getting the shape correct. I don't have to worry about adding kinks or anything like that in there. I can just focus then on getting the correct topology. And yeah, I tend to not, when doing stuff listening, use the mirror tools as much. I tend to just kind of minus it in the X, then undo, because that also doesn't do great things. You have to clean it out as well, because your UVs, not that we UV at this stage, but I would advise to UV as you go along, because it just makes it a little bit easier in the long run. But yeah, and I'm pretty much doing the same thing. So I think the first one was the intention was to go through and show this sort of quad draw sort of method that I use, so I don't have to worry about really defining shapes once I've done it. So you can make this in using just a flat plane and using bend modifiers, which we do on some of the other parts. So I kind of tried to go through lots of techniques to build stuff, and they're not always the right techniques to use for that particular time, and you can see that's where I make my mistakes sometimes. But half the time it's the discovery on how to do things, which is the most important. So we probably could have done this with a would have probably been quicker doing it with a bend modifier, making it whole. And but the thing is, with the bend modifier, you have to have an equal amount of sort of edges for it to bend without kinks. Whereas this way, it'll always relax. Takes a little bit longer, but it almost sort of guarantees you a much cleaner sort of mesh. And you'll notice that I kind of use these planes as sort of placeholders to build extra geometry around, because it's just easier to snap to geometry sometimes. So, although I'm not sure if you can really make much sense of this, but just experimenting with a different style of tutorial, I guess. It might not even be worth watching this as a tutorial. It might just be an interesting watch. I don't know. I find it much easier to learn hearing it the way I sort of teach things, because that's just, I find it quite difficult to learn sometimes. So I need it very almost like walk and talk through. So that's why my tutorials are kind of like walkthroughs. So you can sort of see in here as well. I'll also I don't tend to always modify my actual mesh that I've done that I'm happy with. I'll make patches. So I'll modify it off on a sort of a different piece of mesh, then I'll attach it to the mesh, just so I can, I don't know, it's just, everyone has different ways of doing things. There's no really wrong way of doing things. There are wrong ways of having the end result, basically. So don't worry if you're doing something long and arduous way. There are obviously quicker ways, but all that matters is at the end, it's production ready, which probably most tutorials don't actually go through. There are a few good ones out there, but here's a classic example of me making mistakes, thinking I should probably reduce this, but I was like, actually no, it's not going to really work. It would be better for me to keep a uniform amount of polys around it than extrude up, just so I can get the top part nicer. So you see me extrude up now uniformly. Cool, let's just move on to extra bits. I do try to keep as much as I can in one. I try to, it's hard to tell with this model because it's obviously not real, but anything sort of mechanical and something real, try and model it in the parts that you think are correct and logical, and it will just a little bit like the chainsaw, which we will eventually get around to finishing. It just turned out to be a massively long project, which I couldn't really commit to at the time, but cool. So most of these techniques are all pretty similar. Just going through and just making all the geometry as correct as possible. And I know there's loads of other techniques that you can do to model, and it's not necessarily, it's just using all the tools that you have available. So don't feel like you have to use something. You can do whatever. You can attempt to do this all in the script editor if you want. It might take you like 10 years, but I probably wouldn't actually. But if you're like an absolute genius at scripting, I'm sure you can make some pretty cool stuff. Cool, so I'm just going to literally just going through this whole thing and just try. I tend to always like start fresh from actual cylinders and spheres because I know they're always uniform, and it means if I make something new and it's kind of, for me, it's more of a sanity check. So if I keep modeling off the same piece of geometry, I could make a mistake in there, and I always do make mistakes. When I recreate a new fresh sphere, and I know it's perfectly round, if it's starting to not really work with stuff that should also be round, it's a good indicator that something's kind of gone wrong. And that's just something for me. You don't have to do that, but it just means it's like a little sort of sanity check for me. And this is another example of the quad draw technique that I use quite a lot. That's not a super complicated shape, but I want to make sure that it's subdivision friendly, just in case, like, they're not really ever going to sculpt this, but it's worth just going through the motions anyway. So you can see that I've made like a high res base mesh, so smooth, and just use this quad draw over the top basically, so I can then focus just on the topology and not have to worry about the shape. And I have been quite, like, some of the stuff's quite high poly for what it needs, but it just means when you go into the texturing sort of stage and you're smoothing stuff out, you have less. You can preserve the edges on the UVs, but it's a little bit different in VFX. You can get away with being more high poly stuff or getting correct subdivision. But it's not incorrect in games either. It's just more. It's a different way. It's a completely different sort of beast. Games are quite difficult, purely for the fact that you've got limitations. You've got to be constantly focusing on poly counts and stuff like that. I'm not sure what it's like these days. I mean, consoles are pretty good, but yeah. So that's another perfect example of me making new polys, so I know that I've not done anything weird with that previous one. And when we get to the rigging, this will probably be quite an interesting piece to rig, because we need to make sure it works only in a couple of axes, so it doesn't rotate wrong, go through the geo. But it'd be great to see how you guys' stuff is getting on. I've seen a couple of you guys uploading some progress, and it's looking really good. And I know it can take quite a while, but once you've got it all done, you should all be pretty good. And you get onto the texturing stage. It's different when you're modeling and you have to keep it. You're working to a concept. When you're working to a concept, everything takes so much longer because you have to be very precise about things, and you have to think about things quite concisely, because it has to look like the concept at the end of the day. That's why reference is key, basically. So it's very easy to sort of create a character that's just been made up in your head, because you can always say, oh, it's supposed to look like that, but this is why things take a little bit longer. And I really noticed that I just pretty much almost, for these sort of things, I use, because they're quite bespoke parts, they're not really real life parts, I use this quad draw technique all the way through. And sometimes I probably could have just chopped off bits of mesh and attached it, but sometimes you get caught in the moment. So yeah, so I'm basically, you can see here, I'm practically like rebuilding a section, because I can just delete 3/4 of it, then duplicate it across. So time spent just making that small amount of geometry to chopping a bit up, attaching it. It's figuring out where your time is more well spent. Because you see here, I only make 1/4 of it, then I just duplicate it. Although I forgot to actually model up to 1/4, I think, so I had to actually add some extra ones in. So yeah, you can see me just going around and just adding some more supporting edges in, just for the subdivision. I always have to do this, but it's because it's not being sculpted and it's quite a hard surface object, it's not so bad. But it's always good to keep sort of aware of it. God, it's quite difficult to talk through these speed runs. Only halfway through. But, yeah, I hope you guys have been enjoying this series. We will be going on to, I think I have, today was the last UV one, so we'll be starting texturing tomorrow. Here's another good example of me using the sort of modeling just a patch and attaching it to pre-existing geo, so I don't want to have to remodel the whole thing. I always try and reuse geo and modify it. Always find it's the best way. Well, it's what best way works for me. There's no best way, it's just more efficient for me. You can see here I've done the same thing again by modeling a high-res base mesh, then almost using the base mesh topology as a guide for equal amount of subdivision. I'm probably just going to end up repeating myself quite a lot on this, but I know. So if you find this a better way, or I can do this after, I'll still do the tutorials the same way as I've always done, because I feel that's actually learning something. And not everyone will learn the same way, so I know I prefer to have long, slow, boring tutorials that feel like they're talking you to death, but some people can quite happily just do it through something like this, I guess. So I'm just modelling up the hand and pretty much using the basic sort of tools, just sort of like getting it nice and tight to the sort of reference. You can see I'm always using PureRef to sort of double check, and I bring up my blocking as well to double check that my proportions are not going crazy. So now I start modelling on the fingers, and luckily the fingers are pretty much all the same, so we can get away with a lot of duplicates on this. You can see here I'm actually using a boolean as well. So booleans are fine as long as you always fix them. But I'll always use my boolean for like, so like I've like same thing here. I've used my base mesh, then I can properly retopologize it. And you don't have to do the whole thing. You have to do half, then you just duplicate it across. then you can work out the correct topology to get these sort of the correct edges in. This, albeit it looks pretty simple, it's actually still quite a complex shape to get right, because you have to get all these in, and I don't particularly like doing mass beveling, so I'll always try and get... You can use creasing and stuff, but it depends if you're doing... I try to get a lot of my hard edges in with sort of fencing and adding edge loops. You can use bevel, but it's quite expensive on poly count. Obviously it looks great, but sometimes it can cause pinching. You can also use creasing in here. I don't always use creasing because I don't know, I think sometimes it's obviously great, but I'm not sure if it's cross compatible. I think if you like, it only goes, I think it follows through Alembics and FBXs, but if you need to take it from an OBJ over to something else, I'm not sure if it follows it. I might be completely wrong, but yeah, you can basically get the same sort of results with the same poly count, just using creasing. So yeah, I'm just going around and using the quad draw and stuff to get those edge loops in. So I'm pretty much just using the same technique throughout, and yeah, I don't want to repeat myself over, but I guess you can. It's nice for you to watch over it, and we can sort of chat about stuff. So there's another simple thing of reusing bits and attaching them from other bits of geometry instead of starting off fresh. Then most of it's just going to be duplicating these sort of fingers, apart from the fingertips. So you're also using what you saw, the sort of lattice there. That is the lattice, or a lattice deformer. So you can sort of do a generic sort of scaling and deforming of it. You can see I'm just using a soft select to sort of sculpt it out as well. So I'm just making a fingertip, and I've reused this piece here, and I've just reduced down the edges so I can make it a bit easier for me to shape that sort of thumb. And using the sculpting tools to sort of relax it as well. So obviously you can spend quite a long time doing stuff like this. Personally, I'll probably actually spend longer refining this, but for the tutorial and stuff like this, I want to get to a nice, good standard that you're happy with, but also do it in a relatively good amount of time. So this is another case here where I'm just made the thumb, then I've stitched it to the other piece of geometry. I probably could have made the cog bit a little bit better for the subdivision, but it's fine for what it is. Cool. So now once I've done that, I just group all of them so I can just manually place them. Probably in hindsight, I probably should have made them straight maybe, and then adjusted them on the rig. But it was fine. You can, when we get to the rigging stage, it's no big deal. You can orientate your bones correctly. And now I'm just making some sort of bits to cover up the big open gaps. This is probably me fixing some dodgy bevels. Yeah. So when you're doing the bevel, you want to make sure that you're getting all your edges, otherwise you'll end up adding horrible stuff to it. So it's always good to double check that you've beveled correctly. I think we're almost done with the hand, and we're just going down into the waist bit. A lot of these bits are fairly simple. Cylinders with extrusions and stuff like that. Nothing complicated. Keeping this very simple because it's going to be rigged and skinned. So we don't want too much geo in there for the sort of the skinning process, because it can just make it a little bit more tricky. Yeah, it's crazy seeing this in a time lapse, because how much time goes into it, and how much time will go into yours as well, depending on how close you're putting it to the reference. This will be another example of modelling to a high-res base mesh using quad draw. So I'm just using these actual round objects and the half sphere, subdividing them enough so they're smooth, and quad drawing the actual shape I want. I'd say this looks like a lot, but you only have to do a quarter because you can duplicate the rest. And if you've got 1/4 done correctly, it just makes everything so much easier, because you just duplicate it. You don't have to worry about the rest. But obviously, because we're working with a hard surface model, you can be a little bit more relaxed, I guess, with the topology, but you really want to make sure that it is, it is pretty nice, because if you're showing it on your show reel, it's going to be the sort of key thing they're going to look at. They want to see this attention to detail of your modelling, whether if you're keeping everything nice and clean. So even at the very simplest sort of models, if you can't keep your geometry clean, it's only going to be worse when you do like super complicated models. So yeah, I've gone through. I'm just going to go and I reuse a lot of parts if I need to. I can reuse and sort of, yeah, basically just edit them and reuse them for parts, basically, so I don't have to remodel stuff. I think, yeah, I'm just checking the pivot points of stuff and kind of making it, because we didn't really, depends on how you want to make it, because the rig is extremely simple. It's not really, I wouldn't say it's the best. There are definitely better rigging tutorials out there. I'm not a rigger, but I can do enough just to get me by. But it's a simple rig that will get you animating with this. You can see here that I'm just doing the sort of shin guard thing. And now moving on to the foot. So we're actually mostly getting this. This is almost done now. So I've just box model out the foot, and in hindsight I probably could have done this a better way, but I thought this would be the simplest way. But and it's a good example of why you should always keep an eye on your poly and edge count, because I make a bit of a mess with this as well, and yeah, I make mistakes. And you could also do this with a normal map, or a bump map, or a displacement map. You don't necessarily have to model it in. It's more of just the exercise, really, and just how you can get create this subdivision mesh from doing stuff like this. See, it's not very clean, but I think I spent way too long on this. You'd ideally want to spend, I don't know, enough time to make it nice and clean, but I think I underestimated how long this took me. But it shouldn't take you very long, and you probably do it quite quick with a retopo, I guess, if you wanted to, but I kind of like to keep it all clean and manual. Have a bit more control on my edge loops, because it's really important that you do keep an eye on them, because it makes modelling easier in the long run. But yeah, and this is where I've made quite a few mistakes not keeping an eye on my edge count. I end up with more edges on one side than I did the other, so I couldn't close it up but it's not a big deal. You'll just get to see me make a bit of a mess now. Probably see the worst bit of modelling going on, but you can make yours better. And see in a minute, I'll show you the PureRef tools in Wire, which are great, but I think for this particular mesh, it kind of didn't like it. And it's just me going through and fixing the edge count, and just try making it all quads. It is a bit of a mess, and you could probably do a lot better with time, but I'd already spent too much time on it. Yeah, we just do a bit of soft selection on the foot, just sort of build the base out, and sort of focus on the smaller details of it. So even though it's quite a simple, it's not a complex model at all, but to make it match as close as you can to the concept makes things more time consuming, because you have to match it. It's like when you start working, if they hand you a concept, you have to make it look like that basically. There's no grey area. You either do it, and if it doesn't look right, you got to keep going. So it's good practice, and you will see how long things take when you're matching to reference. Let's see, we're doing the eyes here, and the little earplugs. I think in this bit I'm actually cleaning up everything, renaming it, making sure it's all nice and tidy for sort of UV prep and the texture prepping. So it's really important that you do name stuff and keep it all tidy, because it makes it easier for the riggers, and most places will have a naming conventions that you have to follow. So it's good to get practice of, even if you make up your own ones for now, just that makes sense to you. Get used to the process of making sure you name all your geometry correctly. And I'm making the other foot, because it only has his name on one foot, so yeah, I think it's almost up. It's almost done. So I'm just like doing some small. I use soft selection quite a lot because I prefer it over sculpting tools, because you can just pull it around a bit easier. So yeah, we're pretty much done. I used a deform lattice to sort of do some final changes, and yeah, and the rest is sort of cleaning it up. Sort of just getting it all ready for UVing. Obviously, you probably want to UV as you go along, but I didn't. But yeah, if you've enjoyed this, yeah, put something in the comments, and yeah, see you in the next ones. Thanks for watching.